And now for our program. At a time when Jewish community is facing mounting concerns about outreach to interfaith families, declining engagement among the millennials, and drops in congregational affiliation, the CJE is honored to host 3 of the world's foremost educators, innovators, and thought leaders of the Reform, Conservative, and Modern Orthodox movements to address the challenges facing American Jewry after the Pew Study. Each of these distinguished panelists plays a pivotal role at the forefront of their respective movements' efforts to chart a new course for the future. I won't go into great detail about their bios and accomplishments because you can find them in your program. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Rabbi David Ellenson, Chancellor of Hebrew Union College, representing the Reform Movement's approach. Rabbi Julie Schoenfeld, Executive Vice President of the Rabbinical Assembly, representing the Conservative Movement's approach. Richard Joel, President of Yeshiva University, representing the Modern Orthodox Movement's approach. And lastly, our moderator for this evening's discussion, former chair of the CJE Advisory Committee and last year's honoree, Janie Schultz.
Good evening. What an exciting night to be Jewish in Dallas, Texas. First, I want to take a moment to congratulate Joy and Ron Mankoff. This honor is so well deserved. Your commitment to Jewish education, engagement, and continuity are inspiring to all of us. Since this is an educational event, we thought we might take advantage of the opportunity to learn with 3 of our most important thought leaders today and begin with a short text study. Up on the screen is a Talmudic passage that reflects one of the community challenges we all face: community infrastructure and basic human needs. As a way of getting to know each of you a bit, will you each share your thoughts on this passage? I'll read it, and then you can respond with your thoughts. Rabbi Chama Bar Hanina and Rabbi Hoshaya the elder were strolling in the synagogues in Lud. Said Rabbi Chama Bar Hanina to Rabbi Hoshaya, "How much money did my forefathers invest here in these synagogues?" He said to him, "How many lives did your forefathers invest here? Were there not people who were laboring in Torah who needed the money more?" Rabbi Abun made the gates of the great hall of study. Rabbi Mana came to him. Abun said to him, "See what I have made." He said to him, "For Israel has forgotten their maker and built palaces. Were there no people laboring in Torah who needed the money more?"
Well, I guess as an opening observation is that these are questions that people have been struggling with for centuries and centuries. And for us to remember, the Pew Study was mentioned, and every time the community is in the immediate aftermath of one of these studies, we always have a moment of forgetting that the fundamental questions that we struggle with are ones that our ancestors have struggled with since the beginning. So in this case, we see what it shows to me is, first of all, that we need both, right? We need synagogues and schools. They are the backbone of our community, of our institutions. They are our footprints on the ground. And they are the way that Jews who move throughout the world know to come and look for Jewish community. And at the same time, more than ever, and here I do actually see a change in the last 15 or so years, we need more teachers, more rabbis, more educators than ever before. At the Rabbinical Assembly, I see congregations and schools coming to us, and they need a smaller congregant to rabbi ratio. There is more need on the part of individual Jews to connect to a tradition that for many of them seems farther from reach. And so we really have a time and an opportunity, I think, for the whole country to follow in many ways in the footsteps of a lot of the good that is represented by what's happening here this evening, which is to really focus on education, to really try to close that gap to the extent that if you stand back and think about it, synagogues and Jewish schools are some of the most underfunded institutions in the country compared to the scope and the breadth of what they are trying to accomplish, what is their mandate to accomplish to change people's entire lives. And so I'll just close with the thought that at the same time that the challenges are great, the reward is infinite.
Well, I think Rabbi Schoenfeld said it really quite well. I would like to respond to the particular text in a very specific way and then move on to some of the other issues that were discussed. As I had said to you earlier this evening, it is funny, odd, I'm not quite sure what the word is, serendipitous, that this particular text, I had just written an article in honor of President Joel's predecessor, Rabbi Lamb. A Festschrift, a book of essays, was presented to him for all of his accomplishments. And when I did that, I decided to pick a response from a Jewish legal text from the 19th century. In New Orleans, I am an historian, so you'll have to bear with me. In New Orleans, there had been a decision made by the community perhaps to erect a statue in memory of the philanthropist Judah Toro. And the members of the community, though, in 1858 wrote to Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch to ask him whether, in fact, it was permissible to build a statue in honor of this great man. Rabbi Hirsch responded that it was not appropriate from a Jewish perspective to create a statue of a man, but he did it by actually citing, among other things, this particular text. And the way in which he cited it was that he said, well, of course we do need buildings. The way it begins when one rabbi says to the other, look how wonderful avotai hayu, kama kesef heim shik'u b'makom hazeh, how much money they invested in this place. And he responds and says, well, how many souls did they actually save? How many souls in whom did they invest while they were here? It seems to me that the great element of the gift that the Mankoff family has given and the direction in which your community is moving is that ultimately what these books are helping to do is to create Jewish souls that will in fact be a gift that will last in perpetuity, as their children said in the film. That is really the greatness of it. And Rabbi Hirsch ended this responsum by saying, Eino sin nefashot l'tzadikim, we don't build monuments for the righteous. Divrei u ma'asehen heim hein zichronam. Their words and their deeds constitute what their true memorial is. It seems to me that what this text is attempting to say, and I think the Mankoff family has done this here in Dallas along with other people in the Federation, is that what you're attempting to do is to invest in souls. And ultimately, the reason we need those teachers, the reason why we need those buildings and those schools, is that ultimately what we are investing in is souls, with the belief that, of course, the words of our tradition can help to inspire people and to create the kinds of values and have them be disseminated in the world that will allow for a tikkun, a repair and an improvement to ultimately emerge.
Well, thank you for saying everything that there is to say on this matter.
But you haven't said it, Richard.
That's correct. I'll be a little daring and say I wish the problem that we confronted in the Jewish community were people trying to decide whether their millions of dollars were going to go for programs or for buildings. Let's have that problem. But since the Torah that my colleague shared with you was so on the mark, I'll just share one story that's kind of on the mark. When I worked for Hillel 150 years ago, I had a wonderful elderly philanthropist who would give me $100,000 a year to support Hillel at Tel Aviv University. And he came to me one day and said, I have a hard question to ask you. Am I better off giving my $100,000 for you for Hillel at Tel Aviv U, or should I give the $100,000 to feed hungry children? This, of course, is the kind of question that anybody in the philanthropy business is excited to hear. I thought for a minute and I said to him, look, if that's the question and if that's the choice, then of course give the money to feed the hungry children. But if you're asking me a different question, if you're asking me if there's a reason to spend $100,000 on Hillel at Tel Aviv University, the answer is the following. Without your $100,000, how's the next generation of young people going to know that they're supposed to worry about feeding hungry children? And number two, even if the miracle of miracles would happen and all children in the world were well fed, are we done? Is that what our aspiration is, to have all the animals at the top of the food chain well fed? Or is there something more to our humanity? Is there something more to our being kima'at ke'Elohim, but little lower than the angels? Aren't we supposed to imbue in our children the challenge of being Mekadesh the whole, of bringing nobility into every day? And that's why you, this wonderful citizenry, are teaching our children to dream dreams and to dream Jewish dreams.
Great. Well, thank you all. We're off to a great
We
start.
done that?
Well, now I would like to ask you some questions from our own thought leaders. And in light of this being a night to celebrate Jewish education, we would like to ask the first question posed by our honorees, Joy and Ron Mankoff. So question number one. Would it be desirable for the three movements to develop a single curriculum for the study of Judaism, preschool, religious school, day school, etc.? And if not, should the differences in practice and belief, which prevents agreement, be studied and freely discussed by each other in an effort to understand the rationale underlying those differences? We've always asked great questions.
Do I get to start this time? No and yes. No, I'll say a little bit more. In one way, we do have a common curriculum. That curriculum is called Torah. That is to say, if one looks at the written and the oral law, ultimately the foundations that I think all of us want to disseminate to all of our students, regardless of the age, we draw upon the same canon, the same canonical literature. Obviously, I would say that in the liberal movements, or speaking for the Reform movement, we might have a broader sense of what canon is. In other words, just as I would want to study Tanakh, Talmud, Midrash, codes, responsa, I would also want my people to know what Rachel Adler and Marcia Falk and other people have written who aren't in what I would call the classical canon of the tradition. To some degree, the real issue here in terms of trying to develop a common curriculum, question I would ask to some degree then is, how much time do you have and how serious are you? There would have to be different modes of education. If I know that I have children in a day school setting for 30, 40 hours a week, I think you could create a kind of common curriculum that everyone would look at. That would be much different than the curriculum I might devise if I have children 1 day a week for 2 hours or 3 days a week for 2 hours after school. It might well be desirable. Having said that, I do suspect that the lessons that would be drawn might differ depending on the theological positions that one took in regard to the canon, in regard to the literature itself. Certainly from a Reform standpoint, we look to the classical canon of the tradition. It serves as a source of our community. We see the development of the tradition as an attempt on the part of our ancestors to understand how it would be that God would like us to live, so that if God were a human being, God would be happy to be a guest in our home. That's how I try to think of the tradition. Actually, that phrase comes from my mother in terms of talking about what the nature of the tradition is. But having said all that, if I can use one academic word, it would not have for a Reform Jew the same epistemological status that it would have for my Orthodox friend. That is to say, while we would say that the divine could be captured in the process of study, we would not attribute the same degree of divinity, perhaps, to every pronouncement in the tradition that I think many of my, in particular, Orthodox brothers and sisters would. So I think there can be tremendous overlap, and I do think that one of the nice things that occurs, and here you see what it is that you're doing in Dallas this Sunday, when it comes to Jewish learning, all of us really are on a common playing field, and that I do think needs to be emphasized. And here the last words I would state is that I do think that it behooves all of us in all the denominations to emphasize that which we have in common far more than what separates us. That does not mean that there are times where you say, if I can quote someone from another tradition, "Here I stand, I can do no other." There will be disagreements, but having said that, we do share a common Torah, a common heritage, a common sense of peoplehood. And that really can serve la'ached otanu, to unite us in very significant ways.
That's great, and we're actually going to get to some of those commonalities in a little bit. Anybody else want to respond? We don't all have, you know.
Well, I'll say no and no. I think we are very good at working together to appropriately spend other people's money. We have just concluded a 5-year process of spending $45 million that the Jim Joseph Foundation gave to Hebrew Union College, Jewish Theological Seminary, and Yeshiva University to work collaboratively on, as they simply put it, creating more better qualified Jewish educators for the world. And that meant that each of our institutions looked at what our needs were in order to meet that mandate, and in a variety of different ways met it, not in a uniform way, because we really do believe in unity without uniformity. By the same token, in all of the work that we did, we collaborated in understanding what each other was doing to see where there is something from one stream that could be useful in another stream. As far as whether or not we should spend a lot of energy seeing how curricula would be different, I think the house is on fire. I don't know that there's anything tremendously useful to be gained by that. David said so wonderfully that you know, the Torah is the Torah. It starts with Bereshis, it ends with Deuteronomy, and then we have more after that, and there's much to do to learn that. Our energy is directed, as Rabbi Schoenfeld said, in creating educators and exciting educators, in convincing communities that they have to attract educators by offering them dignity and a living and respect and opportunities to grow and be creative. And I think the work that we need to do, as Harold Grinspoon and our honorees tonight have done, are create different vehicles to bring the message of Torah across to the widest possible audience. We'll fight later about doctrinal differences.
Great, great.
I think there are certain areas. For example, every Jewish preschool child should knead challah before they leave school on Thursday, and they should bake it on Friday morning. Every Jewish preschool child. Yes. And every one of us should grasp together the sensory beauty of Judaism. I had the same thought that Rabbi Ellenson started with. We have one Torah, we have one halacha, we interpret it differently, but fundamentally that's the curriculum. And I think what a wonderful world, you know, just before Mashiach comes, right? Jews who don't celebrate Shabbat in a traditional fashion should sit long enough to learn some of the texts about why you light candles just when you light them, right? And why the day, why the universe, right, revolves around that moment. And Jews who don't participate in some of the larger issues of feeding the hungry of the world would sit and listen and learn as to why that really fulfills Hashem's mandate for us. And so ultimately you used the terminology movement, and I'm very interested in the terminology of movement versus the terminology of denomination. They tell us that we are getting past the time of denomination. And if all denomination means is emphasizing our differences, maybe we should emphasize our similarities. But if movement means what movement has always meant, right, that you gather people together around really powerful ideas, you make them want to be a part of it, then we should all be forming the strongest movements we can possibly form. We should inspire as many people as we should inspire. We should wave to each other on the road and get together as often as we can. But that's what a movement really is.
I just want to make sure we...
I just wanted to add one thing in light of this that is interesting. I should say, and I don't know if it's been announced officially to the entire world yet, but if it hasn't, it should be. The Jewish Theological Seminary, under the leadership of Chancellor Eisen, and now Hebrew Union College, under the leadership of my successor, Rabbi Aaron Pankin, who was the president, are beginning a certificate program that comes from the money supplied us by the Jim Joseph Foundation for a certificate in nursery and preschool education in light of the PJ Library tonight. Wow. You should note then that JTS and HUC are going to join together and create a program for certificates for preschool teachers from all over the country. So this is really one tangible sign of where you have two institutions from two movements working together, really completely integrated in this one particular project.
And the only thing I want to add to what Rabbi Schoenfeld said, in really one sentence, is I think it's wonderful if every preschooler would knead challah on Thursday and bake it on Friday, and not do it in preschool, but do it in their home with their parents.
Very nice. So here's the next question. And though he does not live here, we had the privilege last year of hearing from former Chief Rabbi of the British Commonwealth, Lord Jonathan Sacks. He sent us this question to ask you.
He's in big trouble because he's on my faculty.
He's on, yeah.
He's on my faculty until this very moment, actually.
Well, maybe when you get,
Let's see what the question is.
right, and when you get back, you can ask him to answer the question.
Yeah,
which
I have to take unanswerable questions from the Lord, not from this Lord.
There you go.
Well,
What is the one thing that can inspire the next generation of American Jews to remain connected to their heritage and contribute to their community?
Lord Sachs.
May I start
Please.
with that one? And perhaps this is, what happens when you cross the pond, right? But if you want to find out what is the one thing that will inspire the next generation, you have to ask them. And that has always been the case, but we live in a world in which that is more the case now than ever before. It gets back to the question of these ratios of teacher to student, right? There's much more of an emphasis on individuality. But at the same time, the opposite has to be true. That we can't only, Jewish educators, Jewish leaders, parents, grandparents, find ourselves not willing and able to defend and to love a tradition that is often counterintuitive in today's society, that doesn't seem to speak to logic, right? That comes out of an ancient system much different from ours. And so at the very same time that we need to let every generation create this for themselves, we also need to be unashamed and to never hesitate to say, this is our tradition. We stand on the shoulders of giants.
That's great.
I actually find the question somewhat problematic in the following way. To begin with, there are, even within the tradition, Shivim Panim LaTorah. There are 70 faces of the Torah. As soon as the question is asked, what is the way? I already have a problem with it. The reality is, particularly in a tradition that is highly pluralistic, this tradition upon which we stand has numerous voices. One of the most wonderful things about a page of Talmud or studying a responsum is that you have thousands of years of people who come onto the page. When I study a page of Talmud, when I study a responsum, a Jewish legal opinion written in the 19th or 20th century, there are countless numbers of people who express an opinion. I have biblical authors who express an opinion. I have rabbinic authors. I have medievalists who come in. Everyone is there around this table, and they're all different voices, understanding the tradition in a different way. In a world like ours, where the Jewish community is voluntaristic, and we no longer have coercive political authority, in other words, we no longer live in the kind of corporate structure where to be a Jew was a mark not only of your cultural heritage, but it marked literally your political status in the world in which you lived. When that no longer exists and where we have a community that is inherently voluntaristic, the real challenge is, how is it that you get people to internalize and participate in this larger Jewish conversation? That's why we begin to expose children to the Judaism as an interpretive tradition when they're younger. But in the world in which we live, you do have to speak to different people, but we have to understand that people are coming not necessarily from a Jewish core or a Jewish center, but they come from the periphery. Here, Franz Rosenzweig, the great German thinker, at the beginning of the 20th century when he opened a Lehrhaus, an adult education institute, in Kassel, in Germany at that point, said that a learning in reverse order is about to begin. It's a learning that doesn't move from a Jewish center to a periphery, but people who are on a periphery moving back towards the Jewish center. And there are going to be as many points as there are people. What our community needs to do is to open up countless numbers of ways in which people can begin to be part of the community. We need teachers who will themselves be the embodiments of Torah and inspire people. And what we are not going to get in the world we live in is one common way in which we are all going to walk. But what we can do is share a common landscape, which has been the reality of what the Jewish tradition has been for 2,000 years plus.
I'll say simplistically that the answer has to be education, community, and passion. The three of them as one. Education, community, and passion. I'm done. Surprise.
Okay, so this question comes from the Florence Melton Adult Mini School curriculum, of which Dallas has a very active program. So we thought we would take a question from that curriculum. Given that each movement has boundaries that define it and mechanisms for responsive change within those boundaries, as we all struggle to reach interfaith families and millennials and some of the people on the periphery, as you mentioned, how far can you push your own movement's boundaries and still remain who you are?
That is a great question. I wonder about it every day. Listen, the Reform movement.
You do first.
The Reform movement seeks to be completely inclusive. The leader of our movement, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, at the recent URJ biennial, said that we should engage in being audaciously welcoming. I essentially agree with Rabbi Jacobs' position, but then it begs the question about what would the boundaries be? And the reality is you cannot have a community that has no boundaries at all. What I do believe is that we can look at this tradition as one that offers numerous different pathways in for people. Clearly, in a community where you have among non-Orthodox Jews, if the Pew study is correct, a 71% intermarriage rate over the last decade. When some of my friends complain and say that figure isn't accurate, so maybe it's 60%. The technical sociological term, if you want the exact percentage, it's a lot. We have a lot of people intermarrying. We have a lot of people who are not participating and not enjoying, I would say, the blessing of what it means to be Jewish. But in the end, it does seem to me that what we have to begin to create, and this is where education plays a key role, you have to begin to educate people so that the way in which they come to see themselves in the world is a result of an internalization of Jewish norms. After they do that, they may move in different sorts of directions. I mean, the last point I'd make in this regard is when you ask about what the boundary would be in this regard, there's no such thing as a deracinated human being. One objection I have to one thing we've done in the Reform movement is we've created a gender-neutral prayer book. So we no longer use father or mother, we use parent. But I've actually never seen a parent in real life, and I want to illustrate what I mean by that. I see daddies and I see mommies, fathers, mothers, in case you needed the translation of daddies and mommies. Fathers, mothers, I would rather use a multiplicity of images in this kind of way, but I use this as an example here to indicate that as human beings, we're born with a certain gender, we're born with certain language, we receive certain kinds of socialization in the homes in which we are. There is no such thing as a deracinated person. We live in relationship, as Martin Buber would put it. And the reality is then when you want to talk about what the boundary would be, what we have to be in the business of in the Reform movement is creating Jewish selves. We emphasize the notion of autonomy and individual choice. But that individual choice cannot be made in a vacuum. It has to be made from a self that is Jewish, that may come from the periphery, but begins to be informed by Jewish stories, by Jewish legends, by Jewish teachings, by Jewish law. And in that sense, then, a variety of decisions could ultimately emerge. And I think here the biggest challenge that the reform movement has is to educate our people so that the choices they'll ultimately make as autonomous persons is nevertheless one that is informed by a socialization and a period of education that allows these choices to be, in a broad sense, Jewish choices.
That's great.